one of the reasons, and so 2 weeks ago, I joined Trans Support Reno, which is Reno's only trans-centered peer support network and mutual aid collective that's run out of our center. And I went wanting to talk to them about Trans Day of Remembrance, as well as I thought about inviting them for this day. And I realized the odds of this being a mixed trans and cisgender space were going to be slim. And I was like, most of their work is about peer support. I'm going to do the educational piece over at UUFNN. But one of the conversations we had at this meeting is they passed out this GLAD report because they wanted to shift how they were having a conversation on how trans death being reported, how trans homicides are reported, impacts trans mental health. When we hear consistently 82% of trans people have suicidal ideation, when we hear consistently that there's a fake, it's not a real statistic, but it has been published so much that it's ingrained in the trans community psyche that the life expectancy for Black trans women is 35 years old. And that's a false statistic that is not true, but it is so popularized that it is ingrained in the lives of trans people to sit and say, oh, for Black trans women, if you make it past 35, you've succeeded somehow that other people haven't. Mm. And this reporting, when we talk about homicides, when we talk about how trans people are killed, page 5 in this report is their reporting tip sheet. It's their list of don'ts. And I want to just uplift and lift out a couple of these don'ts. And usually I prefer like more positive frames of teaching rather than giving a list of don'ts, but this is important. The first one is don't treat each case as a number. You'll hear, if you go to Trans Day of Remembrance tomorrow, right now, and I'll be updating it today and tomorrow as more reports come in. Right now, we're sitting around 62 people. And so you'll hear that number a lot. This is reminding us that that number is 62 individuals, 62 lives, 62 people. And so it can feel overwhelming to just hold the abstract of 62. And this is kind of this reminder of like, actually, no, take the time, find the list, sit with the names. And that's what we're doing tomorrow, is we're going to read each person's name, have their picture lifted, and we're going to sit with them. The next thing on this list I want to lift up, and Emily, I forgot to tell you to drop the link in the chat, but I hope you did.
I did it, excuse me, I did it earlier and I did it just now.
Thank you so much, Emily. And so we're on page 5 for people on Zoom. The next one is, do not under any circumstance use the victim's birth name if they no longer go by that name, and make certain to use the pronouns the person uses for themselves. It is not pertinent information to adequately grieve someone to know a name they previously used. When you mourn a person who changed their last name because they got married, you don't cling to the maiden name or their original, their previous name as like, this name is what I'm gonna grieve when this person dies. Same case for trans people. You don't need to know to grieve well. And I know, especially for non-binary people, the conversation around pronouns is difficult. This conversation is why here at UUFNN we encourage people to try their hardest to use the correct pronouns. Because when we talk about that 82% suicidal ideation rate, correlation to misgender. When you use he for me and do not correct yourselves, or do not correct other people. I work here, I'm an employee. I have other things to do than correct every person who misgenders me. And every time I'm misgendered without correction, it makes me not want to invite trans people here. Because if the trans person on staff cannot be respected, how are we going to respect the trans people we want to be members of our community? How do we choose kindness even when our grammar flags go up? How do we choose kindness even when our misunderstanding goes up? Like a little red flag of I don't understand this goes up. And so this piece of make certain to use, and it's not to police, it's not to cause panic, it's not to, oh no, someone misgenders Nathan, Nathan's gonna spiral into an abyss. Nathan's been out for 10 years, Nathan knows how to handle themselves. But there's correlations here of how we respect people when they die. And if we cannot respect them while they are living, it matters. Do not put relevant personal details that are not relevant. Do not put in personal details that are relevant to the story. We don't need to know if somebody had a surgery or not. We don't need to know. If they elect to share that information with us, wonderful. But if somebody dies, it's not a question of, well, how long have they been out? It's not a question of, well, did they get the right surgery? Were they passable enough? Those factors actually are not necessary information to how we can meet and grieve the loss of someone. Do not rely on the police as the only source of information on homicide about trans people. When we say 62 people, when we say 392 worldwide, those are reports. Those are the things we have paper trails of. The running assumption is that the number is actually much larger because there's so many barriers to actually getting accurate information. And so police also frequently misname, dead name, misgender. And so what are filed under a cross-dresser was killed. That person could have been a cross-dresser. We don't know. Do not assume murder is the only form of anti-trans violence that deserves immediate attention. I hope I made that point really clear when I was talking about suicidal ideation and suicide, but trans people have higher rates of physical violence and assault, of intimate partner violence, of sexual violence, as well as the daily microaggressions that lead to deteriorating mental health. Covering only the deadly acts of violence results in underreporting the intensity and the amount of violence transgender people face. If we only think of trans people as people who are bound to be killed versus survivors of so many other forms of violence that people across the spectrums of gender experience. Don't only report on stories that place transgender community in the context of victimhood. Sarah and I have wonderful conversations. There's March 31st is Transgender Day of Visibility. This past week was Transgender Awareness Week. We have Pride in June. We have National Coming Out Day. We have Spirit Day on October 14th for LGBTQ Suicide Awareness Day. There are so many other narratives that we can use and lift up to celebrate transgender people. And TDOR for many, many, many people are people's first experiences of trans people.
What's TDOR?
Transgender Day of Remembrance. So for many cisgender people and for many trans people, their first exposure of trans community is at an International Day of Mourning. And so how do we as a community change the narratives of how we, and at the same time, we are still the only faith community in the entire city of Reno that has a Transgender Day of Remembrance vigil. We're the only one, and until UNR started theirs this year, we were the only institution in the entire city of Reno that had an ongoing Transgender Day of Remembrance vigil. And how many other days of trans celebration are we missing? Because the narratives that we're perpetuating of this is the thing we do for the trans people. And it's, we hold their grief, which is a beautiful gift. And also is like, that you don't want to just join the community of, oh, I come here once a year to cry. Build relationships with local organizations working on trans and anti-violence issues in our local region. This year, our Transgender Day of Remembrance event is partnered with Trans Support Unit. The past years, it has been Emily and Sarah running it. And then I got hired, and as the first out trans faith leader in Reno, I am now on the team of leading it. And this is the first year we have 12 volunteers who are helping co-create the event with us from the local trans community. And that this event is for them. We get to grieve alongside them. And the event is centering their space to mourn. And continue to follow the stories. If you see a report of a death, take the time to see how it ends. Do people actually get justice? Oftentimes and historically, there's been a legal defense case of trans panic defense, where the perpetrator of violence was tricked into an encounter with a trans person and they did not know they were trans. And so they panicked and murdered the person out of a place of panic because they were surprised the person was trans. That is a defense that has worked. People have been not charged murder because judges sided with, you were surprised, therefore it was just battery. So how do these stories end? How do we grieve well? How do we honor these people that we don't know, but we have the privilege of every year seeing their faces and learning their names? My next thing on my list was like talking about like, what do we do? And I feel like we just started that. Reno is in a really exciting moment where our center, if you're not familiar with our center, it is our local LGBTQ resource center. They have Trans Support Reno is housed there. They have a trans peer support group of I know they have about 70 people on their lists. Between 30 to 40 people show up every week. There is a support group for parents of trans youth. There is a support group for trans youth being run at our center. We are in this really exciting moment in the history of Reno where trans people are actually getting the support they need from their communities. And when I went and I sat with them, the first thing I acknowledged is spiritual trauma is real. The trauma of trans people growing up in faith communities that rejected them has an impact on how safe they feel coming to a faith community, even one as progressive as ours. And I routinely tell Sarah and Lisa that their wedding was one of the greatest outreach experiences for the trans community that UUFNN has ever offered, because it brought them to a place of trans joy. It brought them to a place of love. And so many of the people who were at the meeting I attended Sarah and Lisa's wedding and would say things like, I didn't know that place existed. And they're coming on Monday back to this place, and we're going to hold a beautiful service for them. And so when I think about like, what can we do? It's how do we show up? And we show up at Pride. And at the same time, we've been walking in Pride for 35 years, and I had a Lutheran look at me on this past June and say, what are you, an evangelical church? Like, are you new here? So what can we do is like this question of how do we consistently show up for our trans siblings and our LGBTQ plus siblings, particularly in a moment in the United States, Nevada, for how garbage the experience of trans youth are in schools, we have more legal protections for trans people than other states. Nevada is one of the few states where I have an X on my driver's license because I can express that I do not want I want my non-binariness to be perceived. And at the same time, Eddie House, the increasing rates of LGBTQ homelessness, the increasing rates of transmitted sexual diseases, all of the trans issues are inherently an intersectional issue. When we do housing justice, when we do ecological justice, when we do indigenous justice, when we do racial justice, when we do class justice, all of that is trans justice. And so as we're kind of like moving towards kind of like a Q&A discussion, I don't have any more spiel left. But when we think about what are we doing, how are we leaving the space after Nathan made everything, Nathan pulled back the curtain and was like, oh, our world's real sad right now. There's still also a lot of hope in our local community of trans people supporting each other and finding institutions that are helping them support each other. We're not going to white savior complex this. We're going to build these relationships. And so building relationships with our center, building relationships with Trans Support Reno. Because there's going to come a time where if Trans Support Reno continues to grow the way it's growing, they're not going to fit in our center. And what does it look like to do the work to make this place safe enough to where they could have meetings here? That's my personal dream. But that means a lot of work as a community to make sure that our people can hold these people well. And so that's, I don't have a witty closing. That's where I'm going to end. But I want to have a discussion. We still have, we have like 30 minutes.
I'm going to start.
Great.
So one of the things we do know is that there are refugees. There are 100 to 150,000, I'm not sure if it's individuals or families estimated in the United States who are on the move because of restrictions in their rights to practice, to be transgender and to get the medical care that they need. And maybe you can talk for a minute, Nathan, about how sort of that level of denial of even the basic right to medical care is also another type of violence.
Yeah. What first comes to mind is Texas. Texas has passed laws that have pretty much equated gender affirming care as child abuse. And that parents who support their child's decision to go through different levels of gender affirming care as it relates to transness. And I want to be very clear that all people across genders experience gender affirming care. A haircut is gender affirming care. Getting your nails done is gender affirming care. Buying clothes you enjoy is gender affirming care. All genders experience gender affirming care. And so what we're experiencing right now is a crackdown on trans people's access to gender affirming care. A breast reduction is gender affirming care. A vasectomy is gender affirming care. Those are not medical things that are being banned. Hormone blockers, which is the big conversation topic, was created in the 60s for cisgender children who were accelerating and entering puberty too quickly for their own bodies. So when we talk about gender affirming care, when we talk about hormone blockers, it is state-sanctioned institutional violence, because what it's saying is we don't want trans people to exist. We don't want them to have access to follow the narrative of transness that we have decided is the institutional narrative of transness. And by preventing trans kids and trans adults to access to medical transition support, the state governments are saying, we don't actually want you to be trans. We don't want you to be in public. We don't want you to have access to these support structures that are clinically proven to save lives, reduce suicidality, to extend, to create joy and comfort in oneself. And so when we think about structural violence, those types of legal restrictions on access, and it punishes not just the child, but it punishes the family. It then coerces parents to not be loving to their children out of fear of losing their children. And it's interesting, and I also want to like be very clear as someone with deep connections to the American South, where it's kind of been sensationalized that people are fleeing, which they are, and there are people who are staying. There are amazing radical activists and organizations throughout the American South who are doing the on-the-ground work to save these lives and to protect these children and these families. And so I'm I don't want to paint a broad brush that like, oh, the South is lost forever as this transphobic hellscape, because it's not. There's a lot of trans joy happening. And there's also a level of class privilege required to flee a state. And so I want to,
Yeah, I get the sense that politically, since the far right has been losing on the abortion issue, that this,
Yeah.
they coalesced around this issue of trans care. And since it's a smaller population that's affected directly, it can be blown out of proportion. So that's kind of the sense I'm getting politically.
I would agree. Yeah, Lois.
I have another comment. I know that Washoe County has a very serious problem with sex trafficking. And I'm sure this is a problem in this group too.
Yeah, and part of, and you'll see it in the more than a number. When it comes, so I want to make a distinction between sex trafficking and sex work. Sex trafficking is people who are forced, coerced, pushed into it out of their will without agency to engage in sex acts for survival. Sex work is a broad word that can mean everything from people who are in their full agency and their full power, in like this is how they've decided to make money for themselves, and people who had no other options and went into sex work as a means for survival and sometimes found agency, power, joy, etc., or were like, this is a stepping stone to something else. And oftentimes you'll see in kind of the media's sensationalization, particularly around Black trans women's deaths, oftentimes, even without doing due diligence and due research, they'll just be labeled as sex workers, prostitutes, call girls. Rita Hester, the woman whose death started Trans Day of Remembrance, there are no factual reports as to whether or not she was an escort, and the police labeled her an escort in her reporting of her death. And so part of it too, and this is where like transphobia and sexism intersect, this is where transphobia and how people perceive the value of the life of sex workers. And so there's pieces of this of disproportionate amount of trans people do engage in sex work, but they engage in sex work in the whole spectrum of agency. So it's not like all trans people are trafficked into it, all trans people are full empowered and happy engaging in it. There are people along the entire spectrum. And so, and I would be curious, particularly around the local organizations who are doing work to combat sex trafficking, how they navigate when trans people do come to them for support and aid. And if they have the necessary resources to respond to those people's needs with respect. Because I don't know off the top of my head. That's just my like curiosity, because that is an issue. And it's an issue as to why I think of there are certain trans people who are kind of lifted up as martyrs or saints or leaders. Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera are kind of these two icons of LGBTQ history, both of whom were sex workers, both were trans, both started a organization called STAR, Street Transvestites Action Revolutionaries. during a time in which transvestite was a word used in common vernacular. And Marsha P. Johnson was murdered. Her death wasn't, the murder was never solved. It's a cold case. Her body was dropped in the Hudson. And it's one of those things of like, and any person who is a sex worker knows the risk of their work, whether they're coerced into it or whether they're choosing to engage in it with agency, there is risk and harm. And so part of, I think, just the lives of the meta narrative, the overarching narrative of transness in the United States, particularly for trans women, is this assumption of eventually you'll have to be a sex worker. And that was the narrative for a very long time until recent years. And the truth is, like, trans women have every job under the sun. There are trans women ministers, there are trans women doctors, there are trans women fast food workers, there are trans women doing everything. There's a really famous trans woman on social media who is the handyman and teaches people how to do like housing fixer-uppers. And I think the legacy and recognizing that our like trans liberation is tied to the revolutionary imaginations of sex workers. And so it's like, it's one of those things where I don't want to like say, oh no, everything is bad, everything is good. It's like, I want us to hold the complexity of like, actually, we have a lot of gratitude and grace to our trans ancestors who did engage in sex work to survive. And that sex work does not diminish their contributions, but in fact, like, provides pathways for hopefully safer ways to be a sex worker. Because for as long as there's been human existence, sex work has existed. So it's not going to go anywhere. But there are ways to make it safe. Yeah.
So let me check in. Emily, do we have any comments or questions through chat or anybody online who wants to join in the conversation?
So far, not much. Leah provides some information, but other than that, no. But anybody on Zoom, I have given you permission to unmute yourself, so please go for it.
So let me jump in. Okay, let me just try one more other, Emily, then I'll go to you.
Okay.
So going back to your comment about the prevalence of transphobia and anti-gender comments in Washoe County, is this a recognized issue, and does Washoe County School District have any programs to try to address this?
So it's not Washoe County, it's Nevada School System.
Oh, right, okay.
And I'm sure there are programs. I don't know the programs off the top of my head, and I don't know how effective their programs are. This is also from 2021.
Sure.
We know I think it is something for our community to look into, especially as we're thinking of.
I know that the teachers are trained around proper use of pronouns, etc. What having a grandchild on the gender spectrum, I learned that the school bus drivers are not trained, but certainly the guidance counselors and the teachers are.
I know when we went to the legislature this past season, our representative, whose name is escaped my brain, she's a 6th grade English teacher.
Lena LaRue Hatch.
Leah, you were there. I don't know. I don't know.
Natha Anderson.
Natha Anderson. And I remember having a conversation with her when I went to the legislature, because I was asking everybody when I was in the legislature, like, what is the conversation of transness in the state legislature? And everybody was like, oh no, we're fine. We're not talking about it. It's not that big of a deal. And then 3 weeks later, there was an anti-trans bill brought to the assembly. And I was like, so I feel like y'all should have been talking about it. But Natha and I had a really beautiful conversation of one of her students who is trans, who does not have an affirming household. And her using her classroom space as a space where that child can experience care, and she respects that child's name and pronoun choices, and knows and has consent from the child to use their dead name in conversation with their parents, as a way as a way to protect that child from the violence that could occur at home.
I think that comes up quite a lot in the school systems,
Yeah.
where the child is out at school but not at home, and the teachers have to navigate,
Yeah.
in the parent-teacher conferences, that situation.
So I want to go back to Emily, go ahead. You had a comment. or a
Yeah, I
question.
wanted to add, it's a side thing that, you know, Sarah and I are part of the same family household, and Sarah goes to the meetings at our center all the time. And she indicated to me that we have a large transgender youth escapees from other states. So, so that a lot of the trans youth that Eddie House is reporting we're a refugee for trans people. You know, our Washoe County, here. So because of how I'm not 100% happy with how we're doing it, but we're really working hard on being affirming here in the state. And so we're getting a lot of refugees, and I don't mean from other countries, I mean other states. So that's happening. That's the historical change that I've observed. So thank you.
A little positive note, Nathan,
Yeah.
this week, I watch television. I'm one of those people, and I'm an old person who I watch the news on TV and not on my phone or whatever. And this whole week, they had trans people on the news and on special programs all this week. So, and I'm sure it's because of this celebration that is coming, or this event.
Yeah.
I hate to call it a celebration, but
Yeah. Well, and the past week, it's National Trans Awareness Week.
Yeah.
As kind of like the buildup of, and it's a celebration of life, but it's a mournful celebration.
I thought that was really positive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jeff had his hand up, just like Bob will come to you back.
I don't know, if it's notorious, but on YouTube,
Mhm.
and I don't know how they prioritize what shorts you get, but as I flip through shorts, I see a lot of self-satisfied cis men saying why it's impossible, you know, for someone to be not male or female, et cetera, and you know, I'm a member, and even in the Patreon of transgender LGBT YouTube channel that focuses on electric cars. And I don't know why I'm getting them. And I don't know if there's even any, but I'm not getting anything that's positive
Yeah.
when I'm flipping through shorts and all that.
I don't have a degree in tech, so I can't speak to how algorithms work.
The code is secret,
Yeah.
and changes every day.
Bob, go ahead.
Nathan, at the beginning of your talk, you let us know how important it was to not define transgender. I mean, anybody that was expecting that would be disappointed. I'm sure there are good reasons for not defining what you're talking about, but could you explain them to me? Why would you deliberately want to not define?
It was not a deliberate to not define. It was, I did not want people to come here and assume I'm going to hand out a glossary. Because this conversation, as you'll see, even in the more than a number, like beyond Trans 101. We are a welcoming congregation. We have gone through various series to become a welcoming congregation. Shelley and I are in conversation on how we renew that welcoming status. There will be hopefully opportunities in the future to do more like introduction to transness. I did not want to frame TDOR and the death of trans people in the lens of an introduction to transness. And so I did not provide definitions in part because I didn't want us to get wrapped up in the 101 of it. My definition of transness is any person who is a gender that is not the gender they were assigned at birth. That's it. And that's why for me as a non-binary person, I do not identify as non-binary. I am non-binary and I do not identify with the gender assigned to me at birth. I do not identify as trans. I am trans because I do not identify with the gender assigned to me. And so that is, in its most simple definition,
It's pretty simple.
is pretty simple. And then the other language that is the partner word to transgender is cisgender, which just means I am the gender and identify with the gender that was assigned to me at birth. And that is not a perfect binary. The reason we call it a spectrum is like you have gender nonconforming people, you have effeminate cis men, you have butch cis women, you have people who mix and match and play with gender. And that's also why I did not want to do a gender 101 component, because if we get in the weeds of what is a trans person, we're not giving the due diligence and respect of how do I respect a trans person when they die. If I'm too preoccupied with what they are, I'm not doing the due diligence to actually honor them. Because when somebody dies or someone passes away who isn't trans, we're not hyper fixated on what they are. We're sad. And so the goal of this conversation is to be like, hey, allow yourself to be sad before you even fall into the curiosity pit. Allow yourself to be like, a person died, a child died, a loved one died, a relative died. And move from that place and be like, it actually does not matter to me at this moment, their whole life story. Because unless it is a person close to you, you're not entitled to their whole life story. I mean, even if it is a person close to you, you're not entitled to that story. But it's one thing if it's a close loved one whose trans has died that you've known for decades. It's another thing when it's the sensationalized face on a newspaper. And so this is like, how do I meet that face on a newspaper with empathy, compassion, and understanding before I meet them with unbridled curiosity? Because for me, it is not a kind gesture to meet a life worthy of grief and mourning to first meet it with curiosity. Especially if it's the kind of prodding curiosity that transgender people experience on a daily basis. And so that was like my intention, was like, before we can prod, I want us to first know someone died. And maybe that will help us not prod and instead build relationship where the stories of a trans person's experience comes out over time through trust, rather than what is often the case where cisgender people assume entitlement to know. Yeah.
Okay, anyone online or in the room who'd like to make any additional comments or ask questions? Tell me, go ahead.
I just think that it's not surprising that there's such a high suicide rate with the trans community, when one of the key pillars of suicidality in general is a lack of self-acceptance, and then you're being explicitly told, that's right, you're not acceptable. And so I find that really horrifying that we do that.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you all.
Thank
I
you.
will look forward to tomorrow, the 17th.